What is up, everybody? It's Liam here to talk about running the 2022 Boston Marathon as a teenager. So I recently finished the 126th Boston Marathon this past Monday. I'm wearing the jacket here and I have my medal from finishing. And I'm 19 years old and I'm a college student. So I wanted to talk about what it's like running marathons as a college student, and specifically finishing the Boston Marathon, which is one of the biggest marathons you can run in the United States. So let's go ahead and get started and look at the Boston weekend. So the Boston Marathon doesn't actually start until about 10 a.m. for the first wave of runners. But you have to get there pretty early just because you have to drive out to the start line, you have to do gear check. So I woke up at 5:30 in the morning and took some Martin, which is the packets that you put in a little bottle, had coffee, had to go get the morning Starbucks run, then got dressed and I left the hotel at about 6:05, 6:10, and then I took the train from Boston, my hotel where I was staying at, took it in downtown, and got to the finish line area at Copley Square at about 6:30ish, and so the buses for my wave and the first wave started leaving at 6:45, so I had to go to bag check. I had a bag that I checked that had a jacket, some shorts, and some more water in it for when I finished. That was a bit of a walk from where I was at the train and then hopping on the buses. So did my gear drop after that, headed back and went over to the buses, and there was security, so it took about 20 minutes just to get in line for a bus, and then finally at about 6:45, 6:50 I was able to get in line for the bus, and then took off at about 7 on the bus, headed out to Hopkinton. So the Boston Marathon is a big straight line, so you finish in downtown Boston and you start in Hopkinton, Massachusetts, which is about a 45-minute drive in a bus that ended up taking about an hour. And so an hour after we left, we finally got there. We took some wrong turns, though, in Hopkinton, so we didn't make it to the Athletes Village, but instead our bus dropped us off a little bit closer to the start line. So usually everyone gets dropped off in the Athletes Village, which is a little less than a mile away from the start line, and you just walk there when it's your turn to get started. But took some wrong turns, so we ended up a little bit closer, but it worked out pretty well. The weather wasn't bad. It was nice and sunny. It was about 45 degrees, so it wasn't too cold. We just sat in a little area where they had restrooms. We were about a quarter mile from the start line, and that was actually really nice. I met some guys in that area who I planned on running with throughout the race. Shout out to Beers and Miles, Chris Gutierrez. He has a podcast, Beers and Miles, go check it out. And some other guys who I planned on running with for the race. So I talked to them for a while, and then after about an hour and a half, it was time to get ready to head to the starting corral. So because my qualifier was a little slow than where I'm training at right now, I was in the second corral. And so my corral was supposed to start about 5 minutes after the first corral, which starts at 10. But fortunately I was able to kind of sneak my way into the first corral. So we started heading over at about 9:30. The elite racers started running at 9:40 for the men and 9:45 for the women, so they did nice introductions for everyone. Molly Seidel got a really fancy introduction. She was the Olympic gold medalist in the women's marathon in Tokyo, and she's from Boston, and it was her first time running the Boston Marathon, so that was cool to hear as we walked to the start line there. And then as we got near the front, we got to the first two corrals, and they were really making sure that everyone who was in that first corral was going first, and then the second was behind them, and they blocked us off right before the start there. They had volunteers lining the course, making sure each corral was in their spot, and then about 2 minutes before the gun went off, they all got out of the way, and we just moved up towards the front. So I was able to start about 15 seconds after the gun, and that was a really cool experience just to see how many people were in the start corral there. It went back a mile at least, and some people weren't starting till even after noon. So it was crazy to see how many people were there. I think the total was about 26 or 27,000 runners, which was amazing to see how many people were competing at the Boston Marathon. So right after the gun, about 15 seconds, then I got started, and from there it was a slow start. Weaving in and out of people was an interesting experience, but overall it was a pretty good time. I mean, at the start a lot of fans were on the sides of the course for the first few miles cheering us on, and so that was cool, and big pack of runners. Even though we were trying to weave in and out, it was nice to see people and say, hey, what time are you running, and seeing who we were going to run with. So the first mile ended up being about 5:50, and my goal for the race was to try to break 2 hours and 30 minutes, which is 5:42 per mile. So we did start a little bit slower, but we picked it up and felt good for the next few miles and really sat right at that 5:40, 5:42 pace. And it was a good first half marathon. For the first part, there were spectators throughout the course. We hit different cities, and there were clear spectators at each city cheering us on, and that was really cool. I had started the race with gloves on, but I actually threw off those gloves about 5K into it, and that was really funny because I went to the side of the course to try to throw it over the crowd and make sure I didn't hit anyone, but they got really excited when I did that, and got a big cheer as I tried to throw it over everyone. But that was really cool, and then a race really started to pick up when we hit about the half marathon mark. That was where the downhill kind of slowed a bit, because the first 13 miles or so were pretty much just downhill, really easing into that race. And then at the half marathon, it's one of the bigger cities on the course. It was really nice to experience the crowds there. They were really carrying us through, and that was a cool thing to experience. I ended up coming through the half marathon at about 1 hour 14 minutes and 43 seconds or so. So I was right on pace to break that 2 hours and 30 minute mark, and the crowds were definitely helping me through that area. I had taken a couple Martin gels at that point, the gel 100s with the caffeine in them. I think those ones are probably the best ones I've used, and they go down nice and easy. And at that point, I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to make it at that pace, and I wasn't feeling great, but I knew that I had to keep pushing. Obviously, the primary goal is just to finish, and then hitting that time marker is the second goal. But kept going for the next 5 miles or so. Miles about 10 or so is where you hit the Wellesley College, which is a girls' school in Boston there, and that was pretty crazy. They call it the Scream Tunnel. The girls were super loud. They were jumping on the fences, so that was really fun to experience. They were going crazy, and that was one of the highlights of the spectators on the course. But then as we got closer to like mile 18 to 20, that's where you start to hit the hills, and mile 18 is about where I fell off that 5:42 per mile pace and really started hurting a little bit. So I backed off, tried to keep it under 6 for as long as possible, but that wasn't really possible once I hit mile 21, which is the notorious Heartbreak Hill. So right before Boston College, we hit Heartbreak, and it was just about a mile uphill. It's about 100 or 200 feet, which doesn't sound like a lot, and it really wouldn't be a lot by itself. But the fact that you hit it 20 miles into a race that has been mostly downhill was just brutal on the legs. So at that point, I had fallen off pace significantly. I think Heartbreak Hill, mile 21, was a 4:37 mile. It was by far my slowest mile on the course, and it was just brutal. My quads, my hamstrings were hurting at that point, but fortunately when I got to the top, I had some friends that had driven from Fort Wayne, Indiana, where I grew up, to come and cheer me on, and they were right there at Boston College. There had been a Jason Derulo concert, so there weren't as many fans out there, but my friends who had visited were right there, and I got to see them, and that was nice as they cheered me on. Really gave me a push to get through the last few miles. But at mile 22, I started to get that cramping again. My calves and hamstrings started to go, and my legs started to lock up a little bit, which was something I'd never experienced before. Obviously, I do a lot of training, but I had never had that kind of experience with cramping in my legs, and so I wasn't really sure how to approach it. So for the last 4 miles, my goal just became to finish. I knew that if I slowed down or stopped, I probably wouldn't get going again. But I also knew that if I picked it up, I was for sure going to cramp and then I wouldn't make it either. So I kind of just sat at about a 6:10 to 6:20 pace for those last 4 miles, just hoping to get it over with and cross the line, and I figured that the crowds would pull me through the rest of the race. Fortunately, that's exactly what happened. We hit the city at about mile 23 and a half, mile 24, and started getting those Boston crowds. You take turns next to the hotel there before you turn onto Newbury Street, which was really cool. See all the crowds. My family was at a hotel about 2.5 miles from the finish, so saw them cheering me on. I think they got some good pictures and videos where you can clearly see I'm hurting and my legs are starting to cramp, but just having those crowds there was enough to pull me through. And then at about a mile left, you really hit that downtown area where you kind of have Fenway just to the right, Fenway Park, and you're passing the big Whoop building, which is the like heart rate monitoring company, and then you make your way down Newbury. You take a final right and then a left and hit that Boylston. At that point, I could see the finish line. I was still definitely hurting, as you can see by the pictures. I was gritting it out. My teeth were grinding, but came through the finish there, crossed the big finish line, and it was everything I had hoped for in the finish, but it was definitely not an easy accomplishment. Those last 4 miles were really bad. I was hurting a lot, cramping. When I crossed the finish, I had some trouble just getting through the chute, and I had to go visit the medical tent, which was something I had never had to do before, and I wasn't very happy that I had to. But overall, it was an amazing experience. Running down Boylston, hearing the crowds right there was amazing. You can see the stands on the side there, and all those people are cheering you on. They're calling out the names through the loudspeaker. They have the big finisher times up on the finish line, and that was really cool to see my name come across there and hit that time, running a 2 hours, 35 minutes, and 50 seconds, which was a big 12-minute PR for me. But overall, Boston was an amazing experience, and I couldn't have asked for a better crowd and a better race overall. Just missed that time by a little bit, but nothing to complain about. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll have more in the future here. Hopefully you keep watching.